Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to get started now. We may have a few attendees trickle in as we get started, but I want to kick things off first by just thanking everyone for joining us for this presentation by my Laser Pulse colleagues on building intentional partnerships between the private sector and development actors to address global challenges. I'm Megan McDermott. I'm the Associate Director of Innovation and Practice at Notre Dame's Pulte Institute for Global Development, and I'm the principal investigator for Notre Dame on the USAID-funded Laser Pulse program, which is led by Purdue University and is in partnership with Indiana University, Catholic Relief Services, Makerere University, and various other local partners through activity buy-ins. So the reason for bringing us all together today is that, given the current moment, the kind of dramatic increase in global poverty and associated challenges over the past almost 2 years, now we wanted to come together to share with you all a set of practical approaches and resources and tools that the Laser Pulse team has developed over the last 3 years of the project. These are resources and strategies that are intended to advance the understanding of these pressing development challenges and to support the formation of more effective partnerships between the private sector and more traditional development actors in higher education institutions to address those challenges. The first portion of our session today, which goes until 2:45 Eastern Time, will explore Laser Pulse's embedded research translation approach, including a case study from the field. And the second half of our session today, which will start at 3 p.m. Eastern Time after a quick intermission, will highlight a series of more specific tools and research findings produced under the Laser program towards the goal of promoting and facilitating greater private sector engagement. Given that the session is split into 2 parts, we encourage you all to jump in and out of the webinar as needed and or based on your particular interests. We've also reserved time at the end of each session for a Q&A, so please do share any questions that you may have in the chat as they arise, and we'll do our best to get to them in the time allotted. I know many of you are probably wondering, for those of you who are a little bit less familiar with Laser Pulse, what Laser Pulse, this sort of very intense acronym, stands for and what the project does. So with that, I will hand the mic over to our program director, Pallavi Gupta, to provide an overview of Laser Pulse before we dive into the presentation on embedded research translation.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you're joining from. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce this fantastic program to you. But before we get started, I have to say, I have worked with private sector organizations myself, including organizations like IBM in India, Autodesk in Singapore, and then PricewaterhouseCoopers Consulting in London. And I worked in this industry for 10 years. I thought I knew a lot, right? And then I joined academia 3 years back, and it was disorienting. It just turned my whole world upside down in terms of understanding the systems, the complexities, and the nuances of this work environment. And by the time I could understand these complexities of academia, I was invited to join this another immensely complicated and intense, to use Megan's word, program called Laser Pulse. Now, simply put, Laser Pulse is a program that brings together these large stakeholders from academia, development practitioners, and donor world, both public and private. They bring it together to identify the overlapping interests and create shared vision and facilitate collaboration. And before we move to the next slide, I do want to mention that I think the private sector, from my limited experience, is actually a very interesting fit here. Mostly because, private sector can and has played multiple roles in the past. They have played the role of researchers, of practitioners, of donors. But off late, going back to what Megan said, off late, I think, these boundaries of who's doing what are becoming more permeable. And so I think, including Laser Pulse, we need to look at these shifting realities to articulate our place in this new world, especially as Megan mentioned, as we emerge and rebuild in this post-pandemic, post-COVID era. So with that, I will try to simplify this Laser Pulse program in the next couple of slides, and also try to sort of reflect together on what we are trying to achieve and how and where the partnerships for our collaboration on opportunities may lie. Next slide, please. So this is I think the agenda that Megan covered a little bit. So I'll move on to the next slide. The urgent need for smarter development, as was mentioned, the population of people living in poverty is increasing. The index is very clear. And we are facing multiple critical development challenges that are essentially beyond the reach of one single sector to resolve. But we all are kind of in it together because we all are impacted by it, either personally or via our own workforce in offices in different countries and the like. Next slide, please. So really, we are trying to come together to think the larger need for research and evidence-based development to address bigger challenges. And in the next slides, we're going to talk about how universities and private sector can come together and actually play a very important critical role in this sector. Next slide, please. So just an overview of Laser Pulse program. Laser Pulse is a 5-year, $70 million program funded through USAID's Innovation, Technology, and Research Hub that delivers research-driven solutions to field-sourced development challenges in USAID interest countries. What that basically means is that we work with USAID missions, bureaus, and independent offices to understand the areas where applied research can bring impact. And for this purpose, we bring together experts, researchers, NGO practitioners, development consultants, government entities, local administrations, and the US state to work together to co-design and create evidence-based solutions, create practices and policies that they can then utilize, the practices that are applicable and relevant to the ground realities that can then be utilized to create and change in the field. And we do this, as Megan mentioned earlier, we do this work as a consortium. And we have a partnership with CRS, Indiana Universities, Accelerator University, and the University of Notre Dame. And we constantly rely on the leadership and expertise of our consortium partners to do this work. Next slide, please. So I keep using the term complex, but it is an immensely complex program. And I think that is why, right from the get-go, the leadership of this program brought together this immense expertise across our consortium members. And it is reflected in this team that you're seeing on this slide. And let me also tell you that this is not the full team. There are a lot of other members and individuals who we bank on in providing their expertise and sharing their knowledge with us in doing this work. Next slide, please. So just to quickly sort of talk about our scope. So as the slide mentioned, we are sector agnostic and geography agnostic. We work in any technical or thematic sector, and essentially all the geographic sector that are overlapping with USAID's partner countries. And we are also open to any and every research methodology that suits the purpose. What we focus on, or what is at the core of our work, essentially, as I mentioned earlier, is that our work should and has to result into relevant, useful, applicable policies, products, and practices that can have impact on the ground. And for that purpose, through multiple iterations, we have in the past 3 years, we have now figured out sort of a perfect model of how to create such strong and engaging partnerships across the stakeholders. And we will talk about that a little bit more in detail in the later slides. Next slide, please. So this is a bit dense, and I'll unpack the slide for you in chunks. So here, I really want to give you sort of a quick overview of what is it that we consider unique about ourselves, about this complex laser program. And we had a lot of back and forth, and these are the 6 components that we think sort of set us apart from other programs. First one is network. So we have a large network of 2,600 plus members. And our network members include sort of development professionals, sector experts, donors, industry collaborators, researchers. And we also are hoping, from now onwards, probably to build out a membership of private sector organization. So we will put a plug for that in the later slides also. But our network is across, 61 countries. And our members have expertise across, as I mentioned earlier, multiple thematic sectors like agriculture, education, health, democracy and governance, environment, water and sanitation, economic growth, gender, crisis and conflicts, and other such areas. The next core component is identifying research needs. Now, this is, and I think I didn't mention, but I only joined Laser Pulse program 4 months back. So I'm still trying to get my head around what these big terms mean and the intensity of these models. So I'll try my best to simplify what identification of research needs mean. So as I understand, we have always believed, at the core of our program, that the development challenges are not simple problems. These are complex and interconnected. And there is rarely one solution or the silver bullet that can solve a development challenge, right? So right in the beginning, we recognized that there is a need for a systems approach that could help in isolating the main gaps that we are, that are sort of preventing a successful development outcome. So via our faculty, Joe Sinfield, we used, innovation science and systems approach to create what we call a systems analysis model to identify these missing factors where we could focus on where these factors, if we focus on, we'll get better outcomes of our research, input, our dollar input, and our efforts, and sort of help us achieve our development objective more effectively, efficiently, and sustainably. So in all this identifying research needs, we have come up with a model which is called systems level analysis. And I will talk about that a little bit more in the coming slide. But the third component I want to take us back to in this list of key components is research funding. So this is it's kind of straightforward. All our research is funded via 2 main mechanisms, core awards and buy-ins. So awards are mechanisms to promote research-driven solutions for field source development challenges. And buy-ins are sort of the mechanism where we work very closely with the USAID missions, bureaus, and independent offices to understand their specific regional priorities and co-design and co-create sort of the research accordingly. And as you can see on the right side, and I will talk about that as well a little bit more in following slides, as you can see on the right side, our research funding is dispersed sort of across the world in different regions and countries. The next component, which we feel is really something that sets us apart, is this embedded research translation. This is what we have kind of designed and perfected, I think, via multiple iterations. It is a model which we sort of bring via which we really bring together various stakeholders to intentionally, systematically, and consciously apply research to the development challenges and co-design the right, in a way, right from the beginning, as opposed to, say, an afterthought at a later step in the project lifecycle. So my colleagues who are much more well-versed in ERT will talk about it and explain the model in detail in the coming slide. The next component, which we hold very strongly, is gender integration. We are very deliberate in gender mainstreaming in our work and in the work of our subawardees. We have created trainings and guidelines for gender mainstreaming, and we provide support to all our awarded projects in order for them to be mindful and intentional about this. And the last component that I want to touch upon that I think sets her apart is the capacity strengthening. So we conduct regular sort of surveys and engagement sessions with our network members to sort of understand from them their needs and their requirements, sort of that we collect from them, and then go back to the drawing board, identify what is it that we can really do in imbibing this kind of capacity in our network. And we engage our experts from our consortium partners to create the required training, design the required training and tools and templates to then share with our network members, so that we are developing this capacity, or we hope to develop this capacity in the world, staying true to our vision of having intentional research and applied research for solving development challenges. Next slide, please. This is the interesting one, and I'll try my best to explain this. So in this slide, I'm just trying to sort of provide a quick overview of what I talked about earlier, about our systems approach to identify the research needs. On the right, you'll see sort of a glimpse of that approach, where this missing factor, or as is called in the context of this model, the success factor, is determined systematically by mining all the multiple published sort of literature, papers, and engaging multiple stakeholders via multiple discussions, sort of to understand where is that gap where if we invest if we invest research, can we then see the best outcome? And you can see in that slide, there are like issues trees per sort of the success factor. And there are 15 certain categories, as I understand, of these success factors. Then we then break out into different issue trees and subcategories and factors. So it's a bit too complex for me to get my head around, and I'm still working on it. But I have my colleagues to answer any question if you have any on this slide. Next slide, please. So just to provide you another high-level overview of Laser Pulse in numbers. So we have until now completed 3 research projects. There are 17 ongoing and 14 pending approval, although I think I have to mention we just got most of those projects approval, so kudos for the team. We have 72 female researchers engaged in across all this work, of 143 total researchers. So 50% of our researchers are women. 25 are female PIs, the primary investigators and co-PIs, 48 total PIs. So again, we are very proud of this, very high engagement. There are about 49 research products produced, 39 research products translated for use. Now, these research products are kind of print and non-print products. So it could be anything like peer-reviewed, publishable journal, paper, non-peer-reviewed products and publications such as, say, journal articles are published, but like technical reports or, blogs or, summary articles on the websites and things like that. And the non-print products could include like toolkit, videos, trainings and stuff like that. And we do put a lot of emphasis on sort of disseminating these products and engaging different stakeholders for the uptake of these products. Because honestly, if this is not being used or is not being utilized by the people who can actually use it and make some difference, then we are just becoming a repository. So we do put an effort to engage stakeholders via different dissemination avenues. And sort of these dissemination avenues could include anything from expert meetings or proceeding at a community practice session or policy discussion, conference presentation, brown bag sessions, and stuff like that. Next slide, please. So with that, I hope I was able to provide a very high level glimpse of this complex program. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Arvind to talk about the ways in which your private sector and universities can work together effectively. Over to you, Arvind.
Thank you, Pallavi. Next slide. Again, I'd like to add to Pallavi's welcome. My name is Arvind Raman. I am a faculty member here in engineering at Purdue University, and along with Yuan Yi and the overall academic leadership of Laser Pulse from Purdue. What I'd like to do in the next few slides is just to kind of provide a background to embedded research translation, a model that we will be talking about in a lot more detail shortly. As Pallavi mentioned, the intent is really, let's say we identify a research challenge and we have researchers and those who implement or those who are translating, the knowledge to action. Let's say, they're going to be working together. One of the things that we had to be very clear from the get-go when we submitted the laser application was we knew we had to be very intentional about making sure that this is not a typical ivory tower kind of research project, resulting in publications only and not really having impact in policy or practice. And so when we submitted our application, we thought of this idea of development research or research to action as more of a value chain, where research goes from, the evidence gathering, the data, the inferences, but it has to go all the way to action, and that happens with some intentional sets of activities that are going to add value to the knowledge product to really get us to action. So just the way as we might think about a value chain in any product or service, we can think of a value chain, if you will, in taking research to action, right? And we knew we'd have to do that partly based on prior experience that we've had here at Purdue in something that's called the Shaw Family Innovation Lab that actually Pallavi was the director of before joining Laser Pulse. But over the years, what we tried to do in that innovation lab is try to work with NGOs, which that work long-term in communities around the world that have identified innovation challenges where maybe tech-based but appropriate tech-based innovation could have a significant at-scale impact if done well and thought through well. In each of those cases, we realized that there was a lot of iterations that had to happen, both during the design phase of the project to during the implementation of the project and post-implementation to make sure findings are being used actually in practice. And we realized that this had to happen. Otherwise, we really, we had to systematically think about translation in laser. But we also knew at the time that we need a common framework. In other words, we knew that in laser, as Pallavi mentioned, we're working in all different technical sectors of USAID. And every project we fund is different in its intent, different in its scope, different in the nature of partnerships, the processes involved in partnerships. And so it became clear that if you're going to be funding so many projects, we need to have some sort of a common framework to be thinking about collaboration, no matter if you're working in food security or you're working in education or in women empowerment, all these things, we need some sort of a common framework. Otherwise, it's impossible to scale up, the mission of LASER, which is to bring researchers and practitioners together for development challenges. Next slide. And so we're fortunate to have a research translation lead led by our staff at CRS and Indiana University and Purdue, that got around thinking about this challenge. Okay, well, we have to be implementing this. How do we think this through, and how do we come up with this common framework to be intentional and systematic about it? So the team put their thinking hat on, did a lot of discussions, looking at models and so on, and realized that there are many aspects as we think of a way to do this common framework. We need to keep in mind, of course, that not only are each of the research projects we fund very different, they're complex, they require different kinds of solutions, contexts are very different, and we also know that translation needs to be built in from the beginning. And we also realized that there was a lack of clear process in this co-production of knowledge. So there was many different gaps that were identified by the research translation team early on, and they quickly realized at a very meta level that coming up with a new model for doing this requires deep intentionality, requires deep collaboration. It has to be iterative, and it has to be context-driven. And so this model has been developed, and it's called the Embedded Research Translation Model. And Laura is going to speak more to this in a bit. If you can go to the next slide. In trying to really prepare for coming up with this model, the ERT model that we're going to be presenting, the team, the research translation team, really did a lot of work on both interviewing many academics and practitioners to really understand, what their experiences have been across. And by the way, these were across multiple sectors of development. What was equally important was they actually did background research, because as you all know, there are some sectors in which this research translation is itself a science that is studied. So for example, if you're in the healthcare sector, you've probably heard of implementation science. There's actually a journal of implementation science. And so the question is, what are the other fields where is there a science? Is there a framework? Is there a common framework by which we can both be strategic and intentional and provide the right kind of tools to help all our research teams, no matter what your technical sector is, no matter what your region is, no matter who your partner is, your translation partner is, can we develop a model, and can we develop tools, helpful tools that will help you partner in your context better? And so that's what the team has done. And so with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Laura to actually describe what the team has come up with to share with you. We look forward to receiving all your feedback on this model. Thank you. Over to you, Laura.
Hi, everyone. So based on the evidence we collected, okay, I think I'm there now. So based on the evidence we collected, the barriers to collaboration are a mix of individual and systemic barriers. First, researchers lack time to coordinate due to academic pressures and the time commitment needed to establish and maintain collaboration. Second, clear differences exist in expectations of the timeliness of the outputs from research projects, as researchers are accustomed to multi-year research projects, whereas practitioners expect faster results. Third, there can be power inequalities in collaboration between researchers and practitioners because of the complexity of the work, institutional constraints, and funding limitations. A lack of funding for translation exists in general. A large part of this is that academia incentivizes publications in journals, and there can be inadequate funding to link research to action. An Ethiopian practitioner that supports farmers said, quote, "Very often what we are seeing, what we are applying is research that was done 8, 9 years ago or even longer. So there's very limited immediate research that's having direct commercial benefit and vice versa. That in itself is disincentivizing the private sector. But if I get involved with researchers, they'll want to do the protocols, they'll have to do 3 years of trials, then they have to do an assessment, then they do another 2 years. It'll be 5 years before anything's come out of it, and I can't be bothered, end quote. However, our research also found factors that can enable collaborations to increase research impact. That same Ethiopian practitioner stated that, quote, I think there are business units that have been set up at some of the leading universities that have a research focus. There needs to be more focus on these business units. The concept is there, but the current structures put in place need a lot more support, and that could be an area that could certainly be prioritized, applied research. How do we commercialize it, and how do we incentivize it? End quote. The evidence gathered in our research supports his thoughts. We found that the establishment of partnerships, long-term funding of these collaborations, and linkages with policymakers can increase the likelihood of research impact. One important facilitator is to establish long-term partnerships based on trust, respect, and common goals. We found that collaborations that led to impactful research translation were frequently based on shared decision-making between partners and the combination of diverse expertise and knowledge. Another enabler is to support the financial and human resources needed to conduct research translation. Research translation is complex and time-consuming, and that requires forethought alongside the sustained effort and funding to achieve impact. Lastly, the engagement with policymakers or the alignment of research with development agenda also increases the likelihood of research uptake. As Arvind mentioned, there is a need for a common framework to think about collaboration and translation across scalable projects. Research translation is generally the process by which evidence acquired from research is appropriately used to guide the work of policymakers and practitioners and the future work of researchers. As Arvind mentioned, there's multiple terms for this, including evidence to action, knowledge translation, implementation science, and evidence-based policymaking. Therefore, building on the past experiences of the Laser Pulse Consortium members and the evidence we've collected, we created the embedded research translation model. We define ERT as an iterative co-design process among academics, practitioners, and other stakeholders, and risk research is intentionally applied to a development challenge. Here you can see Laser Pulse's approach to research translation visually. As the graphic demonstrates, Laser Pulse promotes a model in which research translation is embedded throughout the research process. Researchers and various development actors engage in a close collaboration at the onset of the research project until the dissemination of the translated product. And together they seek ways for research to have wider impact and application. Laser Pulse advocates for an iterative collaborative process to ensure that research solutions are derived through a co-creation process between practitioners and researchers. ERT research projects do not generate evidence and innovation for end users, but instead ERT generates evidence and innovation with end users. The ERT model ensures that research solutions are custom generated for the development challenge due to the early integration of practitioners, NGOs, policymakers, donors, and private sector partners. The purpose is to build on each other's skills, knowledge, and expertise to create rigorous and relevant research that can be ready applied for impacts. Laser Pulse affirms that research translation is most effective when it is collaboratively embedded across all phases of the research project, from identifying the topic to disseminating the results. After a systematic literature review of 5 different research translation approaches, we found that ERT is different in 5 key ways. First, it's a nonlinear process. It's not a 2-step process of producing research and then translating it into programs and policy. Instead, ERT is an integrated process that incorporates potential failures and adaptation over multiple iterations, with the understanding that eventually the results of the research translation will lead to increased awareness, scale, wider application, and impact. Second, in contrast to some research translation approaches, the focus on very localized change, ERT can be applied at regional, national, or global levels. It can be scaled for wider impact. Next, ERT is an agnostic model that can be used in any sector or with any research or evaluation method. Lastly, many research translation approaches lack conceptual clarity or processes to guide interested actors. The ERT model has 4 pillars to guide research teams and research to support research teams. My colleague Chris will explain more about these pillars in the future. First, I just wanted to show you an example of the resources that Later has developed to support research translation teams, and these can all be found on our website listed here. And to make this model more concrete, I will let one of our laser-funded researchers speak about applying the ERT model. You may need to turn the volume up on your computer for the video.
Hi, my name is Dr. Jessica Agnew, co-principal investigator for the Laser Pulse funded project, exploring the use of blockchain technology to improve food security through African indigenous vegetables in Western Kenya. Since the beginning of this project, Virginia Tech and Egerton University in Western Kenya have been working together with our research translation partner, AgUnity, an Australian-based company, to translate research findings on the challenges and opportunities within value chains for African indigenous vegetables into a version of the AgUnity smartphone application specifically designed for this agri-food value chain. This app is built on blockchain technology to improve trust, transparency, and flows of information. By working collaboratively at every stage of the project, our team is developing an app that is tailored to the unique experiences of producers, traders, and retailers of these highly nutritious leafy greens. Embedding research translation in our project from the very beginning through collaboration and co-design has helped us to deliver effective training, design the model of service delivery, and start to plan for scalability to ensure as many producers, traders, retailers, and community-based organizations can benefit from the interconnectedness of the AgUnity app. Hi, my name is Dr. Jessica.
Okay, and now I pass the presentation off to my colleague, Chris Rice.
Thanks, Laura. Hey, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you all. A really exciting topic that we're engaging on today. Again, my name is Christopher Rice. I am our research translation communication lead at Laser Pulse. I'm with Indiana University. My roles with the project generally overlap in working with our projects and support role on the communication side of research translation, as well as helping to tell the stories that emanate and the impacts that come about. So we are lucky enough today, and I'm also lucky enough to be able to introduce the researcher who did the video that Laura just presented. So I'd like to let you all know that Dr. Jessica Agnew is here, and she'll be participating in a discussion with us about how her project has been able to apply the model for embedded research translation with their private sector partner. So Dr. Agnew is the Assistant Director of Research Operations and Program Management at the Center for International Research, Education, and Development at Virginia Tech University. And her project, as just mentioned, is on exploring the use of blockchain technology to improve food security through African indigenous vegetables in Western Kenya. So Jess, go ahead and say hi to everybody.
Hi all, nice to be here. Thanks so much for having me to the Laser Pulse team. Looking forward to sharing our experiences with you today.
Thanks, Jess. Next slide, Laura. So how we're going to work this, the 4 pillars of embedded research translation that Laura mentioned earlier: partnership, collaborative process, research translation product, and dissemination. I'll go through all those pillars in some additional detail with some examples, but I'll also be asking Jess some questions about how her project has been able to apply these concepts in consultation with their private sector partner. So first off here, we have partnership. And so what we mean here, again, is in integrating partners early and throughout the project. Now, we require our projects to have a translation partner. This usually takes the form of some kind of practitioner entity, whether it's a non-governmental organization, a government entity, often a private sector partner as well, that can help take up and tailor the research into something that can be used by someone in the field, by an organization, or cause a shift in policy somewhere. So what we've seen in terms of partnership is that these approaches with the private sector in particular can help to spur innovation into practice. Academics can in turn help the private sector by giving them opportunities to test innovative ideas, to evaluate options, develop new products, and also to integrate research into potentially existing work. So the model for partnership, as we have here in the example, is between Virginia Tech, a university in the US, Egerton University in Kenya, and Ag Unity in Australia, which is a fintech innovator. And here we have a great example of where the private sector has been involved, not just waiting for the conclusion of research to take something into practice, but they've been working actively with the team in implementation since the very beginning. So Jess, I'm curious for you in your case with the project, why did you choose to involve the private sector, and why did you come together specifically to partner with Ag Unity?
Yeah, so first I'll just make a quick mention about also wanting a research partner. I saw a comment in the chat about power dynamics, and I agree with what was said. We wanted to have this all very much held in equal power, so we didn't want it to just be Virginia Tech going into Kenya and doing the research. So Egerton University is an amazing local partner, does a lot of agriculture extension work, and so we wanted to work with them as well as Ag Unity, mostly because we had this idea around blockchain. It's a buzzword. I don't know how many of our listeners are familiar with the technology. It's associated with cryptocurrency. So we kind of knew that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but that there is a lot of potential. And we knew that Ag Unity has kind of figured it out. They have an app already developed. And so we thought, what a great way to go about researching where it would best be used by partnering together with a Kenyan university. Virginia Tech has computer science and engineering experience. My background is in food and agriculture economics. So my co-PI is also an ag economist, but we both have very kind of applied backgrounds. So we knew going into it that we wanted to work with somebody who could be translating what we were finding out about how blockchain might be appropriately used to address some of the challenges, to immediately translate it into something. And Ag Unity already happened to have a product that we could continue to develop and input that research into.
Thanks, Jess. Now, as a follow-up, and I think you were alluding to this toward the end, but what did the academic researchers on your side have to offer to Ag Unity that they maybe didn't already have in the partnership?
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, an Ag Unity communications person, I think the director just mentioned this to me recently as we're planning our outputs from this project, how she's kind of been heralding this partnership within the company because they've been able to get really rich, deep insight. So they have a very human-centered design approach as well. They're very committed to having the local users that the app is designed to assist in their respective activities along the value chain be part of the process, be part of the design. And so they do a lot of things already, like focus groups and sort of this co-creation process. But Virginia Tech and Egerton, with our respective experience in public health, nutrition, and value chain analysis and development, we're able to come alongside them and help them to understand how they could use their app, not just to assist smallholder farmers, which is obviously a very great and key priority, but also to start to extend into other spaces of social impact, like incorporating a gendered component, understanding how negotiation between men and women happen, how this youth can engage, or how this app can engage youth, and how we can use it to impact food security. So we were able to do a really deep dive into that in the field, and that's actually helped contribute to the development of the app, in addition to feedback from the end users as to how the app can best be designed to assist them in the challenges that they experience.
Wonderful. Now, in the initial setup of the partnership, can you talk about the initial steps that you had to partner with Ag Unity, and maybe any issues that you had in terms of their involvement, collaboration, the project scope, or differences in working approaches that you might have had?
Yeah, definitely with a tech company trying to partner with academic institutions. there was a bit of a learning curve, just mostly in how we communicated with each other. So even in this presentation, right, there has been, words used by USAID that might not be used by the private sector. And so just learning to create a shared language, and not having that shared language right at the beginning, there was some, like, we were just not connecting in some ways. I wasn't fully understanding, what they needed to know, and they weren't fully understanding what we were saying. So we had a bit of a kind of back and forth. And finally, one day, my co-PI and I were like, okay, let's stop. Let's like try again. What do you need to know? Like, tell me explicitly, and don't use your tech buzzwords, and we won't use our academic words. So it was all about creating this shared language that kind of just brought us all to the same place, that allowed us to start to fill the holes that we needed to in order to create an app, as well as effective service delivery of that app.
Thank you. Laura, if we can move on to the next slide, we're going to go to collaborative process. So this emanates obviously from a well-established partnership, but establishing a really robust process for working together so that researchers and practitioners, and we say practitioners to mean non-governmental organizations, government, and private sector as well, so that these entities have a solid foundation to work together on toward research translation. And so this creates a large need to establish an equitable process with mutual benefit, active participation among all partners. No one's being left out or left in the dark. We see some really good stuff at Laser in terms of stakeholder workshops, in terms of strategic outreach planning, or coming together for the purposes of testing a product or iteration, co-creation. Some other really good stuff here. The image here is of the responsibility assignment matrix, where you can see kind of who's doing what, who needs to be informed throughout. And some other tools such as detailed implementation planning can help facilitate this type of a process. Some of the questions that we usually like to ask around this are, what are your goals, objectives, and timeline? Who engages in what components of translation, also dissemination, and what activities will be undertaken together or separately? So Jess, for your collaborative process in your project, can you talk about how you're working with AgUnity now and what roles each of the partners play?
Yeah, sure. So we, from the very beginning, wanted, again, everything to be kind of held in common. So we have been having weekly meetings for over a year now. We went to a brief bi-weekly stage where things were kind of more at a lull, but we knew from the very beginning kind of who would be doing what. So Egerton and Virginia Tech would partner to drive forward the initial sort of value chain analysis that we wanted to use to inform the app. But like I mentioned, AgUnity also has their processes that they use to ensure that the app is built on a human-centered design approach. So it was a really great chance to be learning together on how we can gain rich and deep insight, and for AgUnity as well to get more into the value chain analysis and understanding. So yeah, we just meet together, and their role is about the implementation, but Egerton and Virginia Tech have also been assisting in implementation. So it was less like we each have our own boxes of things that we're doing, and it's more of like a Venn diagram. So there are some things that AgUnity is solely responsible for. Virginia Tech and Egerton is like mostly overlapped our circles. We like I mentioned, we really wanted to keep everything fairly distributed. So Joseph, the PI, and I do mostly everything together. But then we provide some support to their implementation. They've provided some support to our research, and it's created this very seamless process in sharing, how the implementation is going versus, research and the types of questions that we're asking to make sure that the results are meaningful on both sides.
And Jess, one of my favorite things that I've heard you say about this partnership is everything is us together. And I think that really speaks to the type of process that you have and the type of process that we'd like to encourage in our projects, and specifically with the private sector, with universities. So Laura, on to translation product. This is the most probably tangible part of our model. This is actually creating something that you can potentially hold and distribute and send out to people and use. So we hope that the active collaboration and robust partnership lead to a research translation product that is co-designed with the research team, the end users, everyone involved in the partnership, run by stakeholders, to really inform or change policy or practice. And so we've seen stuff at Laser in terms of training guides, curricula, various forms of tech, like the app mentioned already, videos, multimedia efforts, applied modeling, briefing documents. A couple of other interesting things I'd like to note as well. You'll hear a little bit more later on about the private sector engagement and learning project, about the evidence gap map that they've developed. And this is a really interesting product in terms of an interactive online tool. You can see what evidence exists in various categories for private sector engagement based on some USAID programming priorities. And users can go in and enter information live online, and this ends up being a really sustainable initiative down the line. Also, I'd like to note our Self-Reliance Learning Agenda project developed these kind of characterizations or personas. These are kind of 2 to 4 page documents that you can hand to USAID field officers that show what some of the community leaders and community members, people who play different roles in local communities, what they expect out of partnerships. And so this tool, for instance, has been able to be applied at USAID to hand to field officers and others working in partnerships on the ground to see what perspectives people generally like to take in terms of capacity and commitment, and also measuring those particular components. So what we have here with our example, and Jess, we know you're working on the blockchain technology application. Can you talk about why this is necessary as your research translation product for the problem that you're trying to solve? And then give us a hint about other things you might be developing in tandem.
Yeah, so we wanted the technology. So the blockchain technology offers certain characteristics that are aligned very well with some of the challenges that we know characterize value chains that include smallholder farmers, like trust and transparency and flows of information. Now, we need some way to get the user the access to that blockchain, and explaining to like anybody really what blockchain is and what it does is not easy. I understand it in theory, and then sometimes the concept eludes me a little if I start thinking about it too hard. And so it's really about this interface. So you don't fully need to explain to every person using the app about the whole blockchain process, but you can be demonstrating, the security of the information. You can't change anything. And so we're actually starting to move into that place now where so kind of backing up a little bit, we wanted to design this app to actually suit the challenges that are faced in the value chain that are suitable for addressing via blockchain. For example, if consumers just want information about the nutrition quality of the vegetables in order to want to consume more, that's not really needed for the blockchain. But we have found that they care about the type of seeds that are used or the pesticides that are used. So this app and demonstrating how it's used has been really key in addressing some of the challenges. So you need some way of interfacing with this complex technology. So that's kind of the first thing. If they're going to gain the benefits to the blockchain, how can we get it to them? And then the second part of our research translation is really like sharing those use cases. Where is blockchain appropriate? Where is it not? Where do you not need blockchain at all? So I'll do a little plug that we have a webinar coming up in October for both the blockchain enthusiast and the skeptic, because we recognize it's not for everything. It's not for every person. So that's where the policy and the practice piece comes in. Where should you be using blockchain? What apps make sense? What other services do you need to integrate with the blockchain feature that are critical in delivering alongside in order to address the constraints? Like if you just address transparency, but not access to insurance, you're not going to get many places because that's also critical. And so that's another piece we're learning about what other services need to be delivered alongside of that we're then sharing with the wider community with exactly the things that you have listed here, not a curriculum, but training guides for how to use the app, how to code. We're engaging youth. And so there's like kind of this whole ecosystem that we're trying to push our results out through, including policy at the policy level. And Kenya is very interested in how to be kind of on the cutting edge of this type of technology. So that's what makes it an ideal country to be sharing this research and informing policy in. Sorry, that was a bit of a long
Fantastic
answer.
No, that's great. Just really quickly, could you talk about some of the iteration that you've been having with Ag Unity on the app in terms of going back and forth on testing and employing the research?
Yeah, so they already had an app. They had the version 2 app. We've now released the version 3 app. Ag Unity really kind of had the cooperative model figured out. So coffee and cocoa, for example, usually cash crops and not so much in the food space, and especially nutritious foods that can support food security. So that was really where my interest came in. Can we take what's already being done in cash crops and turn it into something that could support food security? So they're not quite as used to a value chain that's a little bit more dispersed, a little bit more informal, with no kind of central aggregator. So there have been more than a few challenges in terms of, first of all, lack of familiarity with using a smartphone, just the sensitivity of the technology and scanning QR codes, like needing to hold the cameras perfectly still. How do you make sure that it's actually everything's being traded in the way that it's supposed to? You don't kind of have this kind of one aggregator who can manage these processes. And yeah, so how do you kind of make this work? And then what do consumers care about? That's a big piece of our project. Like I said, we want to be seeing how this can support food security. And so, okay, they care about the assurance of the safety of the vegetables. So how do we put information about that on the blockchain? How do we get that verified? And so this is where the research and the practice piece existing alongside each other, because otherwise, if we had have just done all the research on the value chain and then handed it off to Ag Unity and said, okay, bye, that would put such a burden on them to figure out so many pieces of how to make this work. So that's been a really big part of it.
Great, thank you. Laura, we'll go off to the last pillar now on dissemination. And this is a really fantastic place for private sector involvement in terms of replication and scale potentially. So when Laura was explaining this model, you see this tail over here, and that's really our dissemination side of things, where you get to an increased awareness about what you're doing or the solution that you have. You explore opportunities for replication and scale that can lead to wider application and impact down the line. And we can see the private sector getting involved, as Jess was mentioning, as a partner in the deep collaboration early on with the research teams, the type of funding that we issue, but also, in terms of the replication and scale side of things as well, to continue things or to iterate on them or to scale them down the line. There's a lot of potential there. So I think the last question I'll have for you then is, in the future and, potentially past the scope of your project in Laser, how can the private sector join you in terms of replication and scale and wider application?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So definitely in replication and scale and integration even. So this, is a bit specific to our project, but like I said, we're kind of learning through this research that it's not just blockchain, but blockchain plus. It's blockchain along insurance, alongside credit, alongside other types of services. And there are also things that consumers care about. So we're exploring the possibility of a partnership with a major ag company, because apparently consumers really care about if seeds are certified or not. And so there are ways to integrate private sector offerings through the app, again, in a way that is creating trust and transparency, where consumers have power because they have the information, as do all of the value chain actors. So for us, like it's about replication and finding other places to kind of go into as well in terms of other types of food products as well. This has been about vegetables, but what other types of really rich, nutritious foods could we be using this for that would generate interest? And the other piece is funding research plus translation. It's very difficult. Like, we have so many ideas about things we would want to explore further. How do you create an ecosystem that supports, scaling up? And we need some more research, and it would be of benefit to Kenya and their interest in how to support the tech industry and blockchain specifically, and even artificial intelligence. But it's very difficult to find funding. That's why the Laser Pulse project was so great, because it actually allowed for that. So if you are private sector and you want to fund anything, include us researchers. We'll learn how to work with you, I promise. And we really do believe, and we've really seen the potential for impact and the wider implication. Like, we're already talking about how can we use blockchain in the cotton value chain and to support ethical fashion. And so you really start to see, I'm getting like chills. We have so many exciting ideas about where to take this, but we're not quite at a point yet where it's at the tipping point. So we need a little bit more for research and development. So there's always the investment and the partnership to really scale into the different places that it can create the true impact that we're looking for.
Fantastic, Jess. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for participating in this segment. And to everyone on the call currently, Jess will be around in a few minutes also for Q&A if you're curious more about her project. Laura, you can go ahead and skip ahead another slide too to the next one after this. And I just want to wrap things up by saying, what we've seen from this case study is a collaboration between a company and universities under the umbrella of government funding. And that's a really amazing case to have all these different partners coming together, and this potential to facilitate research translation and impact through innovation, effective product design, all with the focus behind government prioritized social impact. It's a model for impact that others can replicate down the line, and that Laser's interested in facilitating among many different actors. So with that, thank you again, Jess, for joining us, and I'll pass it over back to Pallavi Gupta to close us out.
Thank you, Chris. In these next couple of slides, I really want to sort of quickly talk about the potential scope and opportunity for private sector to partner with, the USAID and Laser, and this opportunity that lies at the intersection of priorities of these two stakeholders. If you can skip to the next slide, please. Right. So as you can, I would really start with the fact that universities and universities and private sector have a long precedent of partnering on R&D to create knowledge and innovation for public good, much like what Chris and Jess were describing. And so I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a time where we can sort of imagine a little bit more than the typical way that we've been doing this partnership. And USAID has taken a lead on it. So private sector has been very active, actually, in engaging with USAID in creating sort of forums and solutions to tackle development challenges. And here, I want to quickly talk about one of the many examples that are there on the USAID's website and the new policy on private sector engagement. And this is a very fascinating example, and it's called Spring Accelerator. So the Spring Accelerator is actually a partnership between the UK's Department for International Development, which is now being renamed to FCDO, the Nike Foundation, and the USAID, that they came together to sort of design, to accelerate economic empowerment for girls in the parts of Africa and Asia by delivering technical and financial support to early stage enterprises, developing sort of life-enhancing products and services that enable girls to safely learn and save. So this is as I said, one of the many examples of how this partnership can happen and what kind of shape and form this partnership can take. USAID actually maintains, as I've learned, like a long list of private sector entities that have partnerships with them. Some of I've tried to highlight here are Lego Foundation, Google, Walt Disney Company, and many tech companies like Cisco, Microsoft, and others. Next slide, please. So here, just to sort of quickly talk about, again, the potential scope of our partnership, the private sector, USAID, and Laser. And as you can see on the slide, both USAID and private sector have sort of their own multitude of priorities, right? Some of the priorities we have tried to highlight on the blue side are the USAID priorities like democracy and governance, climate change, economics and market development, clean energy, COVID. And there are other priorities that private sector has, many others, but the subset, as mentioned here, again, clean energy, digital technologies, health systems, and etc. And there's an overlap, so to speak, in their respective priorities. And it is in this overlap of the vision, we think that that's where the opportunity for partnership is. And that is where the Laser Pulse can also pitch in and provide and share our experience and services in making sort of this shared vision come true. So again, as you see on the slide, there are certain services that Laser Pulse sort of can provide. We can utilize our sort of experience and expertise in conducting market assessment, gap analysis, desk review, literature review of all the existing knowledge. As we talked about, we can mine the information, identify those key, factors that we need to sort of do the research on, or like evidence, what does evidence-based decision-making look like, evaluating market-oriented solutions, regional or national gaps for effective engagement of CSR for expanding market share for a certain product and investment. So these are the various ways where we think that Laser Pulse experience will come in real handy for both USAID and private sector's partnership if they are planning to sort of systematically achieve their shared vision in a more research-oriented way. So let me give you an example. So let's say one of the organizations present here has a vision to invest in clean energy, or a solar farm in a specific region. And so USAID too has that priority in that region. So here we are seeing sort of an overlap, not only in the region, but also in what the vision is, right? And this is where Laser Pulse can come in and sort of, let's say, do a research on understanding, what to do and how to do it. And we of course, like through our ERT and SLA, we will do it in a way, that has the biggest impact of the investment dollar that are being put into it. And not only that, but also how to do it in a way that is more relevant, to the community and is applicable to in a certain scenario, given the complexities of the socio-cultural nuances, and how to quote what Jess was mentioning that earlier, how to do it in a more sort of sustainable and scalable way. The fact that we use a model like ERT and we use SLA to think through systematically about these questions before doing anything is the key asset, I think, that we can bring into the table to such partnerships. Next slide, please. So as I was mentioning earlier, it's not just the thematic sort of vision overlap, but it can also be as well the regional overlap. I had mentioned earlier on that we work across multiple regions and thematic areas. So a little bit of sort of glimpse of that is shared here in this picture. For example, we work in Colombia, and we work in, we have supported research in Venezuelan migration crisis, or, integrated rural development. In East Africa, we have been working in basic education, food security, water security. Ethiopia, there are critical areas like youth development, civic engagement and leadership, measurement of resilience that we have been engaged in. In Vietnam, we are supporting research in air pollution, water pollution, small and medium enterprises. And there are other, areas like, how tackling, trafficking in person in South Africa, or supporting traditional cultural practices in Northern Iraq, or sort of looking into multi-country study on sort of inclusive education. So we have been sort of doing all this kind of work, research across Tanzania, South Sudan, Northern Iraq, Uganda, to name a few countries. And I guess what I'm trying to sort of show here is not only the breadth of our expertise in thematic areas, but also the reach and footprint of our engagements across the world. And there is a lot of overlap that can be explored here, and we can pitch in and work together. Next slide, please. So, there has to be a call for action for the things that can be done right away. And some of the things we think that we can start on by doing is, well, joining the Laser Pulse Network. We are really, really looking forward to having you join our network so that we can, pick your brain, get your thoughts, get you engaged, get your inputs on what we can do better and learn from your experiences. And then there are, as Laura and Arvind and Chris were talking about, there are so many training and tools and templates that are there on our website, including ERT and SLA, that we all really believe that can be really helpful for your own engagement. So feel free to register, download these templates and trainings, and share it out in your own organizations. You can also use our network to connect with local universities. If you want to do something in a specific region, you want to engage local universities, you want to engage local practitioners, we have a vast membership platform to help you with that. And then, of course, as we were alluding to in the past couple of slides, there's a lot of overlap between your vision and USAID's vision, and that can be together explored and worked on. And lastly, I do want to encourage you all to sort of encourage, in turn, the US House and Senate to fund these HESN projects. So Laser Pulse is part of a vast sort of array of projects the USAID supports, which, under this umbrella of higher education solution networks. So please do encourage, and ask your Senate members and House representatives to encourage USAID to do so. Next slide, please. And lastly, and this is the last slide, we are in the process of organizing post-award R4D Research for Development conferences in Colombia, Ethiopia, and Vietnam, right? And so if you have any interest in coming together, and engaging with, local development practitioners, researchers, USAID missions, and other stakeholders in that region, please do log on to our network or drop us a line, and we'll share more information on it, on that. But we also actually, via our consortium partner, Accelerator, will be launching a networking event in East Africa region, because we have a lot of awards there. So we want to create a more networked membership in the field, in the ground. So if you want to come engage with our members, learn more about the research, please drop me a line, and we'll share the information with you. So with that, back to you, Megan. Thank you.
Thanks, Pallavi, and thanks to all of our panelists. Such an interesting discussion on Laser's unique approach to turning research into action. I recognize that we are at time here, so I really wanted to pose just sort of one question in particular to the ERT group. So Chris, Laura, Jess, all three of you should feel free to chime in here, but I'm curious as to basically how easy or difficult the ERT kind of framework and approach is for organizations external to Laser to pick up utilizing some of the resources that are available, and sort of what exactly is available to them in order to do this on their own.
I can maybe jump in. Oh, sorry. Just going to jump in just because I've done it in real life recently. So I think when you have developed the concept from the beginning to be about embedded research translation, it's fairly easy. So we, like Ag Unity and Virginia Tech and Egerton, we all co-designed the idea and how it would work from the very outset. It wasn't kind of like starting with academia or starting with the private sector. I mean, it started in my head, and I'm an academic, I suppose. So, but we really designed the approach from the beginning. So as soon as we won the award, we knew exactly what to do and how we were going to go about the embedded research translation strategy, which was really what our whole project was based upon. So it may seem daunting, but I think when you have that mindset from the beginning, it's fairly, not easy, but doable, I'll say.
Yeah, I want to build on what Jeff said. As we are aware right now, nobody else has taken it up. So if you do take it up, please keep us posted on how you go. And I do think it's about intention. So as long as you intentionally think about these things and you use some of the resources that I was able to share, I think you can do it on your own, because it's not the same for everybody. It's a process of working through the people that you need to work with and finding out what is the best for the people that you are partnering with, for the people that'll be the end users of your research, and then the context that you're going to be translating the things into. And I'm going to let Chris put some more on the resources that we have available, because I know.
Yeah, Laura, if you could go back to slide 21. There's some extra stuff that everybody on the call here, if you register in the Laser Pulse network, you will have access to. Just to add on to what's been said, though, this might seem like a complicated or daunting model, and the graphic itself that we showed with the infinity loop and the spiral might seem complex. Really, what we're talking about is impact on the ground, research impacting people's daily lives, and the way to do this through the model, the most basic way of saying to do that, talk to people and work with them who have the experience on the ground. Do it early. Don't save it for late. If you can take that out of the model and run with it, I think you're 80% of the way there. And to get from 80 to 100%, here's some extra stuff on the slide. Laserpulse.org/learning. A lot of different things you can take up in terms of templates, guidance tools, training materials as well that can help you fill in the details and the gaps.
Thanks, Chris, Jess, and Laura for responding to that question. I think that was a nice, encouraging way to sort of wrap up this part of the session. And, just again to plug, please visit the Laser Pulse website at laserpulse.org to find these resources and to register for the network if that's something that you're interested in. We do have a part 2 to today's session that will start in just over 10 minutes, where we'll focus more on some specific tools and studies that have been conducted under laser around private sector engagement and facilitating a greater ease of collaboration between development actors and the private sector. So please, everyone who's available, stay tuned. I think that'll be a really, really interesting discussion, and we have a bit more time dedicated for questions in that session at the end. So looking forward to seeing you all again in a few minutes after our brief intermission. Thanks again to our part 1 panelists for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the second part of this webinar. And we're going to specifically dig into some research and tools that we have been working together with USAID on around private sector engagement, and really getting into kind of partnerships and how to more effectively collaborate with the private sector. And I'm really delighted to introduce our panelists for this afternoon, as well as pass it over to our esteemed colleague, Tatiana from USAID. But first, let me introduce you to our esteemed colleagues. First, Tatiana Pulte, who will be starting off and leading this afternoon's presentation on private sector engagement. She's going to be specifically talking about the learning agenda that was developed at USAID and what led to this collaboration with the Purdue University Catholic Relief Services and the University of Notre Dame specifically for this work. Tatiana is the Senior Director of Evidence and Learning and Data at the Private Sector Engagement Hub with USAID. Next, we'll be listening to Joe Sinfield, who is leading the perspective study along with his colleagues at Purdue University Joe is the director of the College of Engineering's Innovation and Leadership Studies program. And then finally, or next, we'll be talking to Priyanka Bernice, who is leading a failure risk analysis study. And she is a postdoctoral research scholar with Laser Pulte. Marcia Croft is with Catholic Relief Services. Marcia has been working with her team on an enduring results study, and she'll be giving us a snapshot of the results that have come from one of those studies. My colleague at the University of Notre Dame, Paul Perrin, who is our Evidence and Learning Director with the Pulte Institute for Global Development and a faculty member here at the Keough School, will be taking you through the evidence gap map that Chris mentioned earlier. And finally, I'll be talking to you about a harmonizing indicators tool that we've developed with USAID. And I'm the Education and Entrepreneurship Director here at the Pulte Institute, as well as a faculty member. And then our colleague Megan will be taking us through the Q&A. So why don't I hand it off to you, Tatiana, to begin the discussion.
Great, thank you, Melissa. And thank you for also manning the presentation itself. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you all today and to talk to you about USAID's interest in private sector engagement that led to this research partnership with Purdue University, the University of Notre Dame, and Catholic Relief Services. I'm not too sure how much you know about USAID, so forgive me if I'm redundant. But just as a short background, the United States Agency for International Development is an independent agency within the United States federal government. And we're primarily responsible for administering civilian foreign aid and development assistance in over 192 countries. Next, please. So our interest, we view private sector engagement as very important in the work that we do. First and foremost, because we understand that private sector engagement is a pathway to help countries advance to self-reliance, meaning it's a means to an end, right? It's a way to think about and achieve much more sustainable outcomes with the end goal in mind of getting to a place where these countries and the communities that we support no longer need our support to ensure their well-being. And so to that end, private sector engagement has a lot of, we understand the private sector has a lot of incentives as well as interest and stakes, right, in the markets and in the communities that it exists in, and we're very much interested in partnering and collaborating with private sector enterprises to ensure that our goals, the end goals, which have never changed, reduction in poverty, what economic, social, environmental well-being are achieved in an enduring and lasting fashion. Excuse me. So to that end, we also understand that private sector engagement spans a spectrum of different types. It takes up different forms. Our experience has been that there is no one way of collaborating with the private sector. You know, even from the initial initiation phase, right? Sometimes we, USAID, and our missions overseas identify an opportunity for collaboration with the private sector. Other times, it's co-created. That opportunity or that activity or alignment is co-created. And yet other times the private sector has identified opportunities where support from USAID and USAID's influencer convening power may be useful to advancing that outcome forward, right? And we also understand that for private sector engagement, or that private sector engagement occurs across different sectors that we work in, education, health, democracy and governance, in addition to economic growth, of course, as well as different contexts, right? Honestly, like the private sector is just such a key player, period, in the countries and in our lives, right? In people's lives. And so it's They're also an essential partner, whether you live in Niger or South Sudan, which are considered fragile contexts, or whether you're in Peru or Colombia. Next. And so to that end, USAID had developed and published a private sector engagement policy, which really sets forth the vision and operating principles that will guide us in advancing our engagement with the private sector. And in addition to this policy, we've also created, next slide please, a evidence and learning plan, which is agency-wide and speaks to a coordinated effort to develop and design activities that can strengthen and improve the use of evidence by USAID and its implementing partners in decision-making on private sector engagement approaches. Next, please. And so the goal of our approach to evidence and learning is to really strengthen the evidence, right? So either by identifying and filling critical knowledge gaps around how does private sector engagement operate, what is it, how is it effective in a development or humanitarian assistance context, as well as improving the rigor of research and evaluation around private sector engagement. The evidence and learning plan also champions the development of meaningful monitoring indicators for private sector engagement for our activities so that we're also generating information by which we can learn from. And then finally, it prioritizes sharing and using this evidence and information for learning purposes. Next, please. Oh, so there are actually 3 learning questions that guide all of our endeavors. And while I think Melissa might be pulling it up, I can just quickly verbalize them. First, what we're really interested in is learning how and to what extent does private sector engagement improve our development and humanitarian outcomes. Just very, very basic, right? How and to what extent. Second, we're also interested in how context and context factors drive effective engagement with the private sector. And then finally, what we're interested in is in the relationship qualities that influence the results or the effects that private sector engagement has in our programs and in achieving our outcomes. So these questions, we understand, will not have definitive answers, right? As I mentioned, there's a whole plethora of types and forms that private sector engagement and collaboration with private sector enterprises takes shape in USAID. And so the context for each one is so unique and specific that we understand there won't be one answer for any one of these 3 questions. Rather, our approach to evidence generation and research is to require a variety of learning activities or design a variety of learning activities that could contribute more broadly to a larger body of private sector engagement evidence. And it was with this approach in mind of just understanding some of those relationship characteristics around private sector engagement in development and humanitarian assistance programming that we partnered with Laser Pulse and Purdue University, University of Notre Dame, and Catholic Relief Services to fund and develop and design a series of research and tool development activities around private sector engagement that we could utilize in filling in some of these evidence gaps that I'd mentioned that we were interested in identifying and filling, as well as in improving our monitoring systems for our activities here within USAID. So with that, let me pause and then turn it over to Dr. Joe Sinfield from Purdue University, who's one of the principal researchers of the first activity that we'll be talking about, which is the private sector perspective study. Joe, over to you.
Thanks so much, Tatiana. I appreciate it very much. And hello, everyone. As Melissa mentioned, my name is Joe Sinfield, and I am the director of the Innovation and Leadership Studies program at Purdue, as well as the Institute for Innovation Science. And I'm joined on the call today by my colleagues, Willie Burgess, who is a co-lead on the effort that I'll describe, and is also the director of the Purdue Evaluation and Learning Research Center, as well as Daniel Bampo, who is a member of the Purdue Innovation Science Lab, and then Jennifer Dunzik and Lindsay McDavid, who are also members of ELRC. And I mentioned their names and their background not only to give them credit for all the work that they've done, but also to emphasize that we have a multidisciplinary team on this project that spans management, innovation, and the natural and social sciences. And over the last 2+ years, we've pursued a project to carry out what we call a perspective study, and that is to take a look at multiple perspectives on the notion of partnership and draw in insights from those to develop an evidence base that can really inform best practices on the strategies for partnership development. In this regard, to develop this evidence base, we gathered information and insight from roughly 2,400 articles on partnership across literature bases spanning business and the social sciences. And importantly, we're careful to include documentation on different organizational sizes, different interorganizational arrangements, activity in different regions in the world, and also spans of different industry sectors. And then beyond that literature review, we also carried out more than 36 interviews with organizational representatives that are responsible for partnership activity in and outside of the development sector. So we're really trying to get a holistic, well-rounded perspective on what it takes to be successful at partnership. In that regard, we view our findings that I'll share with you in a moment to be quite universal in that they span this large array of application areas and therefore can be tailored, if you will, on a situation-by-situation basis. So with this as a frame, I just want to share the imagery that we have on the screen here, which briefly introduces a new framework to take a look at partnership in the form of a holistic view of a coherent relationship journey. And effectively, what we're trying to show is that the journey embraces a series of critical factors as we move along an S-curve. And that S-curve progresses from initial stages of engaging with the potential partner and discovering and understanding who they are, envisioning our strategy for how we might work together, and those two phases could potentially reverse, depending on whether or not we find a partner first or we find a problem first. And then we move into stages of ultimately working to engage, enter, enact, and end that partnership, while ultimately cultivating a way to make our impacts endure. And if we think about those stages, they're presented here in somewhat of a linear fashion, but in reality, there can be iterative interaction occurring at any one of these stages, as indicated by somewhat of the circular arrows that you see on that graphic. But nonetheless, all of these stages tend to always be present in the development of any particular partnership. Now, this overall journey actually appears quite simple, and it is simple in the sense that it's anchored in 3 fundamental factors. The first is the purpose, and that's illustrated on the screen by the gray circles or bullet points that are located below the curve. And those represent the motivations that drive partner involvement in a partnership. The next is context, and context is emphasized on this screen by the light blue bullet points that are on the screen. That indicates the conditions that form the partnership, the environment in which the partnership is taking place. And then there's thirdly, the relationship enablers. And those are the strategies that organizations can employ to partner successfully. Now, all of that at a high level, again, is quite simple, but interestingly, underneath that, there is quite a bit of nuance. And it's nuanced because we now know that there are really only 14 purposes that encompass virtually all of the reasons an organization may seek to partner. This non-infinite list gives us a way to begin to diagnose partnerships and assess the motivation of those with whom we might wish to partner. It also helps us inform a vocabulary that we might use to frame opportunities, using language that aligns with that purpose that they might have in mind, and emphasizing aspects of our opportunity space that might align with their motivation. Further, if we can think about these purposes, we can begin to see the potential for a situation to truly motivate a partner to remain engaged. On other fronts, we see nuance in context. We've identified about 7 key characteristics that define the partnership environment. And very importantly, as these partnership characteristics change in state across those 7 fundamental variables, they alter the risk-reward equation for the partners that are involved. And that changes their tendency to be willing to partner and also changes the potential to achieve a desired outcome. Finally, from a relationship enablers perspective, we've identified about 13 key qualities that foster the development of a partnership, not unlike an interpersonal relationship. And unlike purpose and context, which in many ways are set by the problem and the situation, these relationship enablers are factors that we can proactively control as a partner. And the better we can control them, the more actively we can apply them before their absence is felt, the more likely it is that we can drive a successful outcome in our partnership. So this overall simple model has fairly vast implications. In particular, counter to popular belief, a shared purpose need not be present to realize a successful partnership. In fact, all we really need is a common activity that facilitates achievement of individual partner motivations. If we are in that environment, we ultimately can achieve success for everyone involved. Further, due to the strong influence of contextual factors, partner selection should likely be involved and focus around a functional view of the problem at hand. What specifically needs to be done in what situation? Rather than simply seeking a partner familiar with a sector of operation, we need one whose experience base transfers to the desired context. Further, the basis for comparison of partnerships, and thus the foundation for translational learning from one situation to another, has to account for these contextual variables as well, as partnership learnings are only transferable from one situation to another when the contexts are similar. So this insight collectively allows us to think about measuring and evaluating partnerships potentially in new ways, not only in the context of progress towards success or outcomes, but also with a focus on the nature of the relationship and the way the relationship is unfolding. In fact, monitoring the relationship along this journey can help us re-vector a partnership if the dynamics are beginning to go out of ideal conditions and again, enhance the overall chances for success. So in closing, we see that we have a universal model of partnership that's anchored in an understanding of three things: purposes, context, and relationship enablers. And these insights can help us shape how partners are selected, how we pursue and engage them, how opportunities for partnership are communicated, and how organizations document and learn from their partnership experiences. With that quick background, I'll pass over to Priyanka Pernice, who will provide a little bit of background on the failure risk study part of this activity.
Thanks, Joe. Hello, everyone. My name is Priyanka Pernice, and I'm here to talk about the PSE process analysis research. We have on our team Dr. Yuan Yi, who is the PI for this research, and Mindy, who is a PhD student, both from Purdue School of Industrial Engineering. We work very closely with our partners, Dr. Marcia Croft, who's an advisor from CRS, Susan Ross and Tatiana Polito, who you heard from USAID, who have also co-created this research with us. The overall purpose of this research is to help USAID streamline their PSE process for them to become what they call the partner of choice. We used a systems approach and mapped USAID's PSE processes and identified key barriers and bottlenecks in their process. We conducted more than 60 interviews across 12 countries and 6 development sectors. We also conducted 360-degree deep dives in case studies with 8 USAID private sector partnerships and interviewed not just USAID individuals, but also private sector and implementing partners and any other partners that were involved. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we found that USAID private sector engagement is an iterative and ongoing life cycle that can be broken into 3 main phases. We call them the exploration phase, the formulation phase, and the implementation phase. During exploration, the focus is on initiating contact and exploring the purpose of engaging. If parties believe that there is some value in engaging further, then the discussion moves to formulating an engagement by delving into shared objectives and navigating the procurement and legal processes. Once the engagement is formalized, implementation can commence. And ideally, once the implementation sunsets, the process returns to exploring future opportunities, and thus it's called a life cycle. This life cycle, though, is very complex, it's nonlinear, and based on several different variables. For example, depending on how involved private sector is in co-creation and whether or not they are the ones implementing the solution, it really changes the way this partnership is designed and configured. We learned that the reason for this complexity is for USAID to be able to design partnerships with private sector actors that are right for development. USAID wants to leverage private sector's amazing networks and expertise. They want to pick their brains to develop new and innovative approaches to solve development problems rather than just buy their innovations. If you can click the next thing, please. However, as I said, we are looking at barriers and bottlenecks in the process. We analyzed our data and we found that there were a lot of drop-off points during this life cycle where the process could break down, causing process delays or inertia. Not aligning on scope, sometimes even within organizations, or not knowing how to make initial contact
Not finding the right contact on the website can become a drop-off point for both USAID and private sector. We found that the formulation phase had the most number of bottlenecks or barriers, as expected. Partners might be motivated to address development problems very broadly, but might get stuck figuring out the nitty-gritty. For example, everyone's motivated to eradicate poverty or work on bolstering economic development, but we found that agreeing on specific objectives, how to operationalize them, which geographic region to select, how to finance the engagement, figuring out these kind of details in a timely manner is challenging and can easily become a drop-off point. Implementation has its own challenges, specifically around developing shared work plans and capacity to perform, especially with external factors like COVID. If you can click the next slide. What we found in our data across all 8 case studies and over 60 interviews was that it boils down to 3 main root causes for these bottlenecks: alignment, communication, and the capacity or capability for both USAID and private sector across all 3 phases of the life cycle. Each of these words consists of a host of different types of challenges underneath. For example, capacity during exploration might be related to an organization's capacity to engage, or a USAID mission's risk appetite. During formulation, capacity might be related to private sector's capacity to simply understand USAID's regulation, while in implementation, it could be about the implementing partner's ability to perform or conduct MEL reporting. Thus, I would like to conclude that if there is a systematic process to find alignment and that fosters intentionality and commitment between partners and USAID throughout the life cycle, we could narrow the gaps of cultural and organizational differences, strengthen internal and external capacities, and align processes, resources, operations to achieve shared goals. You're welcome to reach out to me for more details. At this point, I will pass it over to Dr. Marcia Croft for the next research project.
Thanks so much, Priyanka. So now I'll just introduce the Enduring Results Study 3.0, which was, of course, the 3rd iteration of this type of study and was completed at the end of last year. So next, please. This study's goal was to contribute to the evidence base of outcomes and activities that sustain and scale beyond the life of USAID investment with the private sector. The findings from the study are primarily based on document research and interviews across 29 different kinds of partnerships identified as the study sample. The study involved data collection and triangulation across multiple sources, including USAID Partnerships Database, partnership documentation, and semi-structured interviews with partnership stakeholders, as well as secondary research through websites and other external articles and reports. So out of this sample of 29 partnerships, 28 were found to sustain or endure beyond the life cycle of the project. Of these, 18 were found to scale beyond the partnership period, and that was once USAID investment ended in 2017. Findings in this report, however, don't make claims about causality or correlation, and can't also be generalized to all USAID or other private sector partnerships. So today I'm going to leave you with just 3 key takeaways from ERS 3.0 that contribute to sustained and scaled partnerships with development and private sector actors. So the first one that Melissa has up is that we found that partnerships with market-oriented approaches scaled more often than those that were not market-oriented, as in the benefits or impacts expanded beyond those originally involved in the project during implementation. In addition, these impacts often scaled without involvement from additional partners or donors. They primarily scaled through continued involvement by the private sector partners and or the project participants once USAID funding ended. In contrast, non-market-oriented projects often required additional involvement from other partners, such as host governments, other donors, and civil society organizations to sustain and scale. So I think that this finding is particularly helpful for teams who want to prioritize market-oriented partnerships or build in extra measures for ensuring sustainability and scale for non-market-oriented partnerships. So second, the type of assets that each partner brought to the table were really important. So we, for the purposes of this study, defined assets as highly distinctive when their value would have been less when contributed by anyone else. So for example, investment capital from the private sector could have come from a non-private sector partner and had the same effects. Assets that were highly distinctive when contributed by the private sector were the relationships, proprietary information, and brand value. when private sector actors contributed highly distinctive assets, 76% of these partnerships scaled, compared to just 45% when assets were less distinctive. And I think this is really helpful when designing partnerships and thinking through all of the different kinds of assets that both private sector and USAID can bring to the table. And then finally, partnerships that were aligned with commercial interest were sustained through continued activities by the private sector in 89% of partnerships studied. However, when partnerships were not based in companies' commercial interests, private sector remained involved only 40% of the time. So this can be a little tricky, but it's different from a market-oriented partnership. As for example, a technology company could fund a project to connect remote communities with quality medicines, but this wouldn't align with the technology company's commercial interests. If, on the other hand, it was a pharmaceutical company that was part of the same project, this would be more aligned with their commercial interests, and the pharmaceutical company may be more likely to continue working with participants after the project. This finding can be particularly helpful when you're selecting partnerships or prioritizing between different partners for activities that are expected to or hoped to continue after the investment has ended. So these are just 3 key takeaways from the ERS 3.0 study, but there are many more that can be found in the full report, and I'll drop a link in the chat for you to take a look at in your own time later. And now I will hand it over to Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be able to speak with you about the tool called an evidence gap map. I'll tell you a little bit more about what that entails. And I'm mindful that there were a number of people that worked on this with us, including our USAID colleagues, CRS colleagues, and a number of students and consultants who worked with us on this. One of the hallmarks of our work at the Pulte Institute is partnership, and you may have sensed that that's a theme of the conversation today. And I've been in a number of meetings where we're engaging with either non-governmental or private sector partners. And a common question that I often hear is, where do we begin? Where do we begin? That's a very complicated question. It seems simple, but it's actually quite complex because there are so many factors that go into what a right course of action might be. For instance, you may choose to proceed based on instincts that you have as an individual, that things that seem right, that seem fitting. And the challenge with instinct is that it is subject to a lot of bias and other things that can color our perspectives if we're not careful. So the point of the evidence gap map really is to help us check those instincts and start to engage with that question, where do we begin? Well, one place where we can begin is to start to understand what the evidence is telling us about what works and what doesn't in private sector engagement. My own formation as a global health practitioner was very much in an environment that was highly skeptical of the private sector, seeing the private sector as an obstacle to development rather than as a potential partner. And what I've learned over the course of my career as I've engaged with the evidence is that that was an instinct that wasn't necessarily formed on reality, but very colored by bias. So the purpose of the evidence gap map, as we discussed with USAID, was a number of different purposes. And I'm hoping that everyone on this call at one point or another has found themselves in one of these 6 buckets. And if you either currently or in the future find yourself seeking to do one of these 6 things, whether it's designing a project, trying to identify a new engagement, or devising, if you're in a private sector entity, devising a CSR approach, then the evidence gap map might be a tool for you, because what it does is it's taken this abundance of information that exists in the world. Part of the problem in asking the question, where do we begin, isn't that there isn't any information. In many ways, it's that there's so much it can be overwhelming. So with this tool, we have compiled a repository of over 600 documents that represent one form or another of evidence in the space of private sector engagement in development. We did this through a robust search strategy in a number of different information repositories that allowed us to identify different resources that we could include in this. So that's one part of the tool, is the repository itself. We then, through a process of a pretty robust and rigorous process, added a lot of information to each of these pieces of evidence that we included. The primary one is around the ways that development practitioners and private sector partners engage with one another, and then the value that this brings to the private sector entity and or the development actor. And so these pieces of evidence are structured in those ways that describe the intended outcomes of that engagement and whether those outcomes were achieved. We also tagged these pieces of information with geographic information, with the sector of the development approach and intended outcome, the sector of the private sector entity, and other points of metadata that allow users of the evidence gap map to distill and filter the evidence base in ways that are most helpful for them. And we culminated, next please, Melissa. We culminated all of this by creating an interactive online tool. This is a screenshot of this, but this is a live tool that is publicly accessible to anyone on this call, and I'll pop the link in the chat. And you can see that there are different ways to engage with the information. The filters at the top allow you to distill the evidence base in ways that make sense to you. There's also a search bar. But this matrix shows where the different points of evidence intersect with the intended ways to engage and the value propositions. This is a living resource. We encourage any one of you on this call who are aware, who have generated evidence, who have evidence to contribute, and there are ways to do that through the website. So please feel free to use this, feel free to contribute to this resource, and in so doing, we can build an even more collective repository of information that reflects our collective learning so that we don't just have to sit around a table and say, what do we do? Where do we begin? We can start to learn from one another in answering those questions. And I will now turn the time over to my colleague, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Paul. And so I wanted to bring your attention to another tool that we've developed in collaboration with our colleagues at USAID called the Harmonizing Indicator tool. And, you know, as has been demonstrated here throughout the webinar, but especially over the second part of the webinar, there's tremendous shared value when both the development and the private sector meaningfully and effectively partner. And I was watching kind of the interaction on the chat, and I want to acknowledge that there may be times when it isn't appropriate for the private sector to participate in some of the development challenges. And it may be that multiple development organizations are working together, or there may be different points in a value chain, so to speak, where the private sector can contribute meaningfully. But our work has been focused on helping to articulate and operationalize the value between USAID specifically and a mission officer at USAID and the private sector. And again, one of the ways that we've been doing this is through this Harmonizing Indicator tool. It maps existing business relevant indicators to standard US foreign assistance indicators, which are also called SBSD indicators. Our engagement has always focused on increasing this mutual understanding. And as we worked alongside USAID to identify meaningful indicators for PSE effectiveness or private sector engagement effectiveness, there was also the recognition that the indicators and tools should utilize a common language and be of relevance to the private sector partners. And we heard this very illustrated very well through Jess's conversation with Chris earlier in the webinar, as she was talking about the language that they were trying to kind of seek this common language between the private sector organization and academia. And this is true of development as well. So we wanted to create a crosswalk demonstrating alignment of interests. Now, that crosswalk started with ESG. There are numerous environmental, social, and governance, or ESG frameworks that have emerged over the last several decades to help investors and companies alike in the measurement of their company or portfolio performance. As a matter of fact, over the past week, I've probably received at least 5 different emails from different organizations about their ESG initiatives or their commitment to developing ESG initiatives or their desire to get investors on board with ESG initiatives. Now, ESG is different from corporate social responsibility or CSR. And forgive me for, if you're already aware of this, but I just want to make sure we're all clear. CSR represents a company's efforts to have a positive impact on its employees, customers, the environment, and the wider community, while ESG looks beyond ethical action and examines the role of these factors on the long-term financial performance of the firms. So such reporting initiatives, and this is not an exhaustive list, mind you, include those that are here on the screen: GRI or Global Reporting Initiative, SASB, Business Call to Action, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, etc. Now, in addition, the private sector is very attentive to the Sustainable Development Goals. Many companies are actually mapping to the SDGs even more than the ESGs themselves, because they are very relevant, straightforward, and widely understood. So now, what does this mean for this tool that we've developed? Well, this is an example or a screenshot of the tool that we have developed. And I'll put a link to the tool in the chat. The process of creating a tool that would harmonize indicators across the private and global development sectors started with 2 related but very distinct critical considerations: determining the initial set of indicators to harmonize and systematizing the process of determining which indicators were considered a fit. So we developed a methodology and tool whereby USAID staff and private sector partners can examine pertinent illustrative indicator linkages. And we produced an algorithm, and I say we, this is the researchers here at Notre Dame, through a text mining process, a set of criteria that would extract important indicators across the various ESG repositories. There's thousands of ESG indicators out there. So this was really a necessary step that we had to take in order to marry or match these SBSD or kind of US foreign assistance indicators with these ESG indicators. So how does this work? And again, we stuck to the GRI, the SASB, the IRIS Plus, and the VCTA, as you see here on the screen. And the tool is sorted according to business theme, business indicator source, or the US government's SBSD category or program area. So by way of demonstration, a sample use case might be that from the perspective of a USAID mission program officer. The program officer wants to invite private sector organizations to participate in planning and implementing market-based solutions to achieve her USAID development goals. And she might access the tool to find common indicators that are relevant to achieving clean drinking water, as you can see on the screen here. She opens the tool and filters by relevant categories until she identifies what is here a small group of indicators that measure access to clean drinking water. She can also use the tool to look for business relevant indicators in the health sector, as well as learn more about the business indicator source. So she can click on BCTA, or at least she will in the future, or GRI, and learn more about the actual indicator from that ESG framework. And really her objective is to generate a common set of indicators that both she and the private sector partner can consider while co-creating an opportunity. And this might include a joint monitoring initiative. So in summary, this is an illustrative example of how the mission officer can consult the tool to determine business relevant indicators. It could be global health, agricultural, environmental, economic, democracy and governance, et cetera, that can be used in linguistically aligning with that private sector partner. What's next? The tool has been initially developed and we're focusing on finalizing that tool with a user guide. And we look forward to including SDGs into the tool as well, which we're working on right now. And I'm going to now conclude this portion of the webinar and pass it over to my colleague, Megan, who will solicit questions and put those to our panelists. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks all for a really great, interesting presentation. I know that that was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but it has clearly catalyzed some discussion in the chat. So I'm eager to start and get into some of the questions. I want to start with a few that I'll open up to all of the panelists that are a little broader and sort of more epistemological. I know, Melissa, you touched on this a little bit in your description of the Harmonizing Indicators tool and your introduction there, but one of the questions, or sort of series of questions, is about the core assumptions that, we appear to be basing this type of research and tool development on. The assumption being that development efforts will improve with private sector engagement. And so, the question being, under what circumstances is this not the case? What are the implications for research by beginning with this assumption? And finally, and maybe we can hold off on this one, but what does funding the private sector do for government capacity? So I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if any of the panelists have some initial or immediate thoughts on any of those questions, please feel free to chime in.
Sure, I can start with the question. I was thinking about it as the other panelists were concluding their presentation, and I think one of the first things I would say, Lucia, is that I don't necessarily know that it is an assumption as much as a hypothesis too, right? So the way that USAID is viewing private sector engagement is as a tool in our toolbox. It is not the end all be all. It's not the way to do development or humanitarian assistance, but it's definitely one that has a lot of potential for yielding and addressing that sustainability piece and the impact and the results that we have. Because number one, the private sector is such a key player, right? Bar none, period, in our lives and people's lives. And often in countries, whether it's a multinational corporation or whether it's an entrepreneur. And so there's also, they also face a lot of incentives, right? That speak to and align to some of the outcomes around enabling environment and the like that we would that we are supporting through our development program. And therefore, I think it is about identifying and trying to align and collaborate and find those pockets of collaboration. And so it's more about, like I said, more of a hypothesis rather than an assumption that development efforts will improve. We're trying to figure that, and we often measure that through our internal evaluations within USAID for our programs as to whether or not that actually happened or what have you. I think with these research work streams, what you see with like maybe what Priyanka could also speak to, but what you see with like these tool development as well is helping us collect that information to also be able to like refute or accept that hypothesis. And then I think as well that there is this distinction between private sector engagement and private sector development. They're slightly different, right? And so, for example, what does funding the private sector do for government capacity? Oftentimes, our engagement is not necessarily funding a private sector enterprise's activity. Sometimes it is. There is a capacity building component. But that also gets into the overlap with development of the private sector. Sometimes we collaborate with, let's say, a multinational corporation who is looking to stabilize their coffee production value chains or commodities, and we see an opportunity there to kind of leverage that incentive, that interest into something that could also benefit the communities and achieve not only economic benefits, but maybe social and environmental. And then I had also mentioned in the chat box, there are also other instances where our engagement with the private sector is purely non-market based, in that, again, they are key actors and key players in an economy, in a country. And therefore bringing them and having them have a seat at the table when we're engaging with government and government capacity efforts is actually very, very powerful. So let me stop there and see if other panelists had something more to say about this question.
This is Joe. I might just build on what Tatiana indicated. And I think going into our work, we actually certainly did not make the assumption. In fact, we were trying to test whether or not partnership is helpful. And I think it's really the anchor of the purpose element of the model that we put forward. If the purpose isn't fulfilled by the partner to close a gap that the partner initiator or partnership initiator has, then we don't want to go there. And there might be other ways to do that. And so it's really about being selective and thinking about the reason why we're partnering. And perhaps the private sector is the right answer to that equation, and we want to carefully evaluate that. I think the other piece that comes up from that perspective is that partners don't necessarily need to be a part of the whole journey of a development and exploitation of a solution, but instead they might come in at very key pieces where they're filling a very specific role. And that's when we need them. And then they move on and we get a different partner for a different piece of that puzzle. And I think that challenges another common assumption and norm in the partnership arena, which is to partner early. Quite often we see that when you partner early, you are, if you will, accommodating the private sector's business model. And their business model puts constraints on what can be success, and you may not want that yet. And so, I think being really objective about when to partner and with whom to partner on different parts of the puzzle is quite important.
So maybe a follow-up to that then, Joe, we did have a conversation during the last portion of the webinar about really having those conversations early across these different stakeholder groups and implementers. So in the absence of having an actual formal partnership, are there other steps that different actors should be taking earlier on as they're starting to formulate their kind of implementation strategies to at least inform one another and prepare for potential future partnership?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of it could tie back to the discussion that Laura and Chris presented on the embedded research translation, to really think today at the very beginning about the scale and outcome we want to achieve at the end of the endeavor, and then start to think through what do we really need to do that. And there might be skills, capabilities, relationships, other attributes or assets, as the term was used, that we know we're going to need to get there. And in that regard, we could begin to cultivate potential relationships to pursue, to carry those out and make those a reality. And so that there's certainly a dialogue is not harmful in helping that, and it can really advance the process.
The one thing that we observed in our research, specifically looking at when private sector and USAID were interacting with each other, was that a lot of the constraints came from different mechanisms that USAID already has in place. So there are, informal or formal ways by which private sector is engaged. And sometimes there are certain boxes that they have to fill out. And sometimes it's really hard to navigate through some of those procurement processes. So the co-creation piece is such an important aspect early on with the private sector. And it also depends on the type of private sector, whether you're working with a multinational, whether you're working with an SME, the type of constraints, the type of challenges, and how you navigate through those challenges is really important.
Can I add one thought? So my mother always told me that the key to a successful relationship was communication. And having been in a long-term relationship now, I know that that's only part of the picture. And a really significant aspect is around expectations and what those spoken and unspoken expectations are, making those clear and explicit at the beginning, rather than having to find those out mid or at the end of an engagement with a partner. So, and I like what the work that our Purdue colleagues are doing that acknowledges that a lot of this work needs to be done up front. so that it is clear going into the partnership what those expectations might be, rather than having to find them out.
So just to tag along on Paul's point, it's very interesting because when we did the deep dives with the case studies, it was very interesting to see that a lot of times, either the private sector already has an idea and they come to USAID with full-fledged ideas. Sometimes USAID already has an idea and they just want to find somebody to help implement that, right? And that's the piece that we really found interesting, is that how can the co-creation happen where the expectations are laid out and not full-fledged ideas are put on the table and then you have to backtrack, does this really fit into our model? So having those conversations, having that setting of the expectations and communication was key throughout the phases of the life cycle.
And if I may, I'll just add one more thing. Our participants can probably tell, we have really great conversations when we all come together as a working group. But we had a similar note. We were talking to a mission in Latin America who actually, they kind of created a roundtable approach where they were having conversations with the private sector with absolutely no intent of a project in mind. So everyone just kind of came to the table, which is a really kind of foreign thought. It's always usually, I have an idea, can you help me with this? Or the private sector might say, we have this product, we'd like to, get it to a beneficiary community. And in this case, it was a really new model of thinking for, hey, well, let's just kind of come together, talk. We don't have any outcomes associated with this other than the potential for a new project. And they said that has been driving their partnerships much more successfully than any, kind of preconceived projects or product ideas in the past. And so that's been, one of the things that led to the creation of the tools, and Tatiana can speak to this. They're working, we've participated in the relationship scorecard. Like, how are we doing, a dating scorecard, so to speak, in terms of how do we engage, how are we doing engaging along the way, and how are we doing on communication? How are we doing on kind of holding up each of our ends of the bargain, et cetera? I'll stop talking now and pass it back over to Megan for any other questions.
Well, to follow up on that, Melissa, I think, that's a wonderful example of people coming together without a very explicit incentive. But, the question, I think the prevailing question always is, how do you get the private sector to the table to begin with? How do you even get them to participate in a session like that and to see the value in it? Which that clearly happened after the fact, but do you know what some of the steps were that were taken to bring them into a session like that from the outset?
I don't want to speak for my USAID colleague. So Tatiana, who has significant more experience in the field, maybe there's an example that you can provide or some motivations.
I think Tatiana had to jump off, so we can table that conversation.
Can I add a thought on that, though?
Yeah,
sure.
I agree.
I think we need to be careful about trying to force private sector entities to the table that don't necessarily see the inherent value in promoting the social good. So if we're trying to provide a carrot saying that this will be good for your profitability, and that's the only carrot we're offering, I'm not sure that is grounds for a really healthy and robust partnership. But if you're engaging with private sector entities that inherently value the social good alongside profitability, then I think there are ways to engage those types of entities. So I think we need to be cautious about trying to force partnerships where partnerships might not be in the best interest of the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve.
I'll just build on Paul's point there, because I think one of the things that was revealed through the perspective study work is that there are about 14 major reasons that companies or private sector entities might come to the table. And one of them is profit, another is altruism, and there's a range of 12 others in between that provide different levels of engagement that they might be interested in for different reasons for their organizations. And I think one of the things we were excited about is that having awareness that those alternative purposes exist can allow us to take a situation in the development sector and frame it in ways that might resonate to address different needs that those partners actually have. And then all of a sudden we are achieving an outcome that's interesting to them and achieving our outcome as well. And it can yield a mutually beneficial situation.
And Joe, oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Priyanka.
Please ask.
I was just going to ask. Sorry. Technology. I was just going to ask quickly, Joe, if you all had done any analysis on various combinations of factors and how that maybe contributes to stronger partnerships or more sustainable outcomes.
Yeah, no, we have not yet. And I think that's an exciting opportunity. Certainly the permutations of these factor combinations becomes really, really interesting. And I think actually that's at the core of one of the comments I was making about context. We know that there's 7 general variables that show up, but when the state of any one of those variables changes, I go from a situation where there's a very pro-business economy to one where there maybe isn't as much pro-business economy, or where there's labor availability versus there isn't labor availability. Everything about that partnership may or may not be translatable to a new situation. And so really articulating that context down to that detail seems to be very important so that we can get organizational learning that we could transfer across situations and then hopefully replicate when we realize that it's relevant. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to do the kind of work you just described me.
And Joe, that brings up another question I had sort of about your work, which is, you've recommended, and I think this is good practice regardless of the situation, but, monitoring partnerships, that partners need to mutually monitor, their relationship. So are there kind of specific ways of doing that that you know of, or is there guidance, or are there certain inflection points that partners should be looking for, particularly in this kind of private sector engagement sphere?
Yeah, and I should probably leave that question my social science colleagues, but I think I'm not sure if Willie or Jennifer are on, but I think one of the key things is the relationship enabler set really calls out 13 things at least that we want to watch for. And part of what we've talked about is that there is an opportunity to create tools and methods to look for those characteristics in the relationship. And certainly those methodologies would be more in their schools of thought, I think, to bring forward from an expertise perspective. I'm not sure if they're on and available to comment, but.
Does anyone want to follow up on that?
There's Jennifer, I think I see.
Jennifer, did you want to contribute?
I don't want to put anybody on.
Unfortunately, the switch to the panelists, I was not able to hear the last minute or so. So in that sense, would anyone mind trying to fill me in what the question exactly was?
Sure. My apologies, Jennifer. My question was just about whether there are kind of specific methods or guidance for these private sector partnerships on how partners can kind of mutually monitor the relationship.
So we are in the process of developing tip sheets and checklists for those aspects that you just listed to help guide that process along, and how different combinations of purpose and context factors can be better navigated through specific relationship enabler strategies. But they are not ready yet, so you gotta look out for them.
Stay tuned. Sign up for the Laser Pulse newsletter.
If I may, Megan, yeah. One of the things that I mentioned earlier is a tool that we were working on with USAID, and they started this work, and we've contributed to it alongside our CRS colleagues. But kind of this relationship scorecard, which kind of gets to kind of an alignment of goals. There may be a formal MOU, or there may not be a discussion about governance. It could be, and so the scorecard gets to when you're establishing the relationship, and then when you're getting into monitoring that relationship. So on the one hand, what's great about the work that we're doing across our work streams is that we're built, as Tatiana mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, we're building evidence for what people might think are some preconceived notions about partnership. And we're kind of, Joe's work and Priyanka's work is demonstrating, hey, this is what we're finding in the research. But then what do we do once we find that out? And as Marcia's enduring results study shows, this is what's coming out from the private sector discussions. But then Paul and I are kind of like, well, what are the tools that officers can use? And one of these might be this relationship scorecard. So that's, it's important to not just kind of focus on the research itself, but also, okay, how do we kind of, operationalize that information for the benefit of the USAID mission officers and the private sector partners.
Marcia, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, sorry, my internet connection is cutting in and out, but just to piggyback off of what Melissa mentioned, I think the relationship tool that Melissa and USAID have been working on is really good. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of times the tools that we've developed for other kinds of partners might not be well adapted to private sector. So, CRS as an implementer often works with civil society organizations or other NGOs in the field, and we have regular check-ins on our relationship, and they can be, full day workshops or maybe even longer than that. And when you're monitoring your relationship with a private sector partner, they might not have as much time to devote to activities like that or full workshops. So if there is a way to adapt tools, as Melissa has been, to make sure that they're really appropriate for private sector partners, it can be a great way to make sure that nobody's expectations are not met, as Paul was mentioning, and that we make the best use of the time that we have together.
Great. Well, in the interest of time, I think I'd like to pose sort of one final question to the group, another broad-based question, which is, in your opinion, based on your perspective, the research that you've done, the tools that you've developed, what are a few of the key factors really in facilitating effective collaboration between the private sector and sort of researchers in particular to develop really evidence-driven solutions to development challenges? Give everyone a moment. It's a big question.
Well, it's in a way for the perspective study, it's PC and R, right? So it's the purpose, context, relationship neighborhoods. But I think more than that, it's the idea that there is a vocabulary behind those things, and organizations of different types have different vocabulary. And to Melissa's point about harmonization, we need to match the vocabulary so that we can communicate on these factors effectively. And so I think that's probably at an overarching level one of the bigger points that we need to address.
Yeah, language and communication, that came up in the first part of our session as well, around the embedded research translation as a really fundamental component to effective partnerships.
Well, we found another factor was around
maybe just to build on that.
I don't know, Marcia, were you going or not? I was going to talk about commitment and this conversation about purpose that we are starting with. How do we get people on the table? But how do we get them to continue that commitment throughout the process is much more important, because a lot of the times in the case studies that we found is, say with COVID or with Ebola, there was incentives in place for private sector to be involved in these conversations. But once the funding dries up, what keeps them motivated to continue this engagement for sustainability purposes? That's another key factor that we need to really think about.
Yeah, and I think there's probably another interesting study and discussion just around this idea of non-market oriented solutions and trying to find those opportunities where there are reinforcing kind of projects between the market oriented and non-market oriented towards that long-term sustainability. And you can't really do necessarily one without the other.
I would just add that it's in my opinion, just looking at the literature that we've been reviewing, it's in finding a sweet spot that allows each organization to get value out of the relationship while also contributing value to something larger than their own individual self-interests. And so what I mean by that, it's not USAID using the private sector like just something that they pick up and then throw away when they're done. And vice versa, it's not about the private sector using development actors to drive profit, but you both get value out of it in some way, but you're doing it for something larger than your individual organizational self-interest. And that's the sweet spot. It's a difficult thing to find the balance between those two.
Yeah, that is the ultimate challenge, I think. Much easier said than done, but that's kind of why we're all here, I think. Marcia, I know you've been trying to jump in.
Sorry, my internet keeps cutting in and out, but yeah, I think an important consideration is, again, just not the only thing, but considering time. As Priyanka was mentioning, there are oftentimes these bottlenecks where things really slow down. And while researchers and development actors might spend years and years working on a problem, time can really be money for private sector partners. And so when these bottlenecks happen, partnerships can fall off. So whatever we can do from our side to make expectations clear, or when possible, speed up the process, can help keep everybody at the table.
Yeah, there's definitely also a delicate balance between wanting to instill that level of rigor in the process, but also maintaining a level of kind of economic efficiency in private sector activities or market-based activities. Anyone else? Final words?
If I could just add, I really appreciated Marcia's comment, because I think it's not an us and them. I think that's kind of what this research and this work is supposed to be illustrating. It's truly about kind of coming together and solving some of the most difficult challenges. And we just got knocked over the head with what many of us have already known about environmental issues this week. And so we need to continue to come together to figure out how to move forward. And to Marcia's comment, what are those bottlenecks, and how can a development organization such as USAID, how can a university partner participate in order so that it's easier for all of us to do this important work, and not create roadblocks for one or the other in terms of getting necessary products and services to beneficiaries. That's the most important thing.
Absolutely. One last call for responses. Anyone? I think that this has been an incredibly valuable conversation. I love to hear about all of this work. Even though I'm on laser, it's just exciting to hear about all of the research and the tools that you're all producing, and how I think invested everyone on this team is in really developing useful material to, the end that Melissa is talking about here, that really facilitates this ease of access and ultimately an improvement in the lives of people around the world. So I just want to say again, thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, for all of the really thoughtful questions and discussion. For those of you who weren't able to attend the first session, or maybe missed part of this second session, we will be making the recordings available tomorrow. So anyone who's been registered for the webinar should receive those in their inbox before the weekend. And I'll plug for one final time that you all should visit the Laser Pulse website. That's laserpulse.org to learn more about private sector engagements, to access some of these tools and research products, and to sign up for the network if you're interested in getting more involved in Laser's activities. So thank you to everyone. was a pleasure to listen to you all speak today. And I'm looking forward, I think we're all looking forward to seeing what comes next.